Hi everyone, I'm Angela, one of your AAA module leaders. This video will give you a quick overview of what's covered in Unit 6. Unit 6 covers the following key topics: what are tests of controls, designing tests of controls, performing tests of controls, and finally, evaluating the results of tests of controls. So before we go and design tests of controls, we need to understand what they are. ISA 330 defines a test of control as an audit procedure designed to evaluate the operating effectiveness of controls in preventing or detecting and correcting material misstatements at the assertion level. One thing to highlight here is operating effectiveness. Do not confuse this with design effectiveness of the controls, which is about whether a control has been designed by management to address the risk of material misstatement. For example, around the payment authorization process, management is responsible for putting in the required levels of payment approval before a payment is made, whereas the auditor is responsible for testing that the payment approvals have been obtained before payment has been made. Now moving on, when designing tests of controls, make sure you have considered the following: the nature, which is the how. For example, are you inspecting, observing, inquiring? Just make sure you bear in mind that inquiry alone is not sufficient as a test of control. The timing, which is when. In practice, tests of controls are performed prior to year-end and sometimes during the planning phase. When this happens, additional procedures may need to be performed, which includes identifying if there have been significant changes in the design or operating effectiveness of controls, and whether further evidence is needed. And finally, the extent, which is how many. Is it testing a sample or the full population? In practice, auditors may even place reliance on prior period controls testing. This is also known as rotating tests of controls. This can only be done in the following situations. You must obtain evidence as to whether significant changes in the operation of those controls have occurred since the last audit. If there have been, then the auditor must test the revised controls in the current year. You must test controls for a process at least once every third audit, irrespective of whether there are any changes. You must test at least some controls in the current year. That is, you cannot rotate all tests of controls for all processes. And finally, you cannot rotate controls that address assertions relating to a significant risk. All of these elements will help you design a relevant and robust test of control. Your procedure is relevant if it is specifically testing the controls identified for the client and the process that you are testing. And your procedure is robust if it is detailed enough that a junior auditor knows exactly what is required of them. When performing tests of controls, there may be times when you may not be able to perform testing. It could be because the audit procedure is not applicable to the selected item. For example, when testing evidence of the customer approval for an order, you realize that the customer order actually has been cancelled. As long as you are satisfied that the customer order has actually been cancelled and it is not a deviation, this item will need to be replaced. Or, it could be because the auditor is not able to perform audit procedures on the selected item. For example, the client has lost the documentation. In this case, alternative procedures may need to be performed, otherwise it would be treated as a deviation. When a client uses a service organization, it is the auditor's responsibility to design and perform appropriate audit procedures. As a quick refresher, a service organization is a third-party organization that provides services to user entities that are part of the entity's information systems relevant to financial reporting. An example is where a client outsources their payroll function to, say, ADP. If an auditor plans to rely on the operating effectiveness of the controls, they would test the controls a user entity has over the outsourced function. Using our ADP example, there are two parts. Are the controls around the authorization of payroll data, for example, new starter and leave taken information, that is sent to the service organization operating effectively? And are the controls around reviewing information that come back to the client, such as monthly payroll reports, operating effectively? If the answer is yes to both, then the auditor does not need to consider the controls at the service organization. Otherwise, the auditor would need to consider if there is a need to test the controls at the service organization. There are 3 ways you can test the controls at the service organization. You could obtain a Type 2 report from the service organization. That is a report on the description, design, and operating effectiveness of the controls at the service organization throughout a period of time. You could visit the service organization to perform tests of controls, or use another auditor to perform tests of controls. So now we've performed our test of controls and we need to evaluate the results. Before we do that, let me ask you, does the concept of materiality apply here? No. Remember, when testing controls, we are evaluating the operating effectiveness of these controls. So what do we consider instead? We are concerned with the rate of deviation from internal control policy or procedure. Tolerable deviation rate is the expected rate of deviation the auditor would find acceptable to be able to conclude the control was operating effectively. In practice, auditors generally plan for an expected deviation rate of 0. The actual deviation rate is a proportion of actual number of deviations in the sample tested. Now let's go through the process of evaluating the test of control results. Dark green boxes specifically represent the steps in relation to each sample. For each item in the sample, consider if the procedure could be performed. If not, depending on why that is the case, the appropriate responses were discussed earlier in the video. For each item in the sample where the procedure could be performed, evaluate the results by asking, did the control operate as designed? If yes, then the auditor can conclude that the control is operating effectively for the items sampled. If the control did not operate as designed, the auditor should investigate the nature and the cause. Is it an anomaly or a deviation? If the deviation is determined to be an anomaly, and there is sufficient evidence to support that the item sampled is not representative of the population, you would exclude and replace the sample. Now, if the sampled is a deviation, consider the potential impact on the audit work. For example, a deviation as a result of a system error may require extending the sample size and/or revising the planned reliance on the system. Then, after ensuring all samples have been tested, compare the actual deviation rate to tolerable deviation rate. If the actual deviation rate is less than the tolerable deviation rate, then the control is operating effectively, and the control risk is confirmed as low. Otherwise, the control is not operating effectively, and the control risk changes to high. Finally, remember that when the auditor has identified deficiencies in either the design, implementation, or operating effectiveness of controls, they're required to evaluate the impact on the audit strategy and communicate these deficiencies in a timely manner to management and those charged with governance. Normally, you would include a description of the deficiency, impact of the deficiency, and a recommendation. And that sums up our overview video of Unit 6. If you have any further questions regarding Unit 6, please post them on the discussion board. Thank you for watching this video. Look out for other unit overview videos in the AAA module. Good luck in your studies.